actually by Luke. RPG Storytelling, Part 1. So, storytelling. Ah yes, the oldest of the creative arts. Possibly. I mean, those cave paintings are pretty old. Also, I think there's been singing for quite a while now. Storytelling. One of the oldest of the creative arts. It's so old, in fact, that there's an entire industry of people telling you how to do it better. And some of those people had some pretty wacky ideas. Yes, Campbell, I'm looking at you. But a lot of the ideas have been passed down from generation to generation, and I mean that literally. The fact that the core principles have been set in stone for about 2,500 years has in no way prevented people from publishing dozens of new books about how to do it every year since. Now, believe it or not, I have a bit of history of writing screenplays, and more relevantly, teaching the writing of screenplays. None of my screenplays have ever been turned into blockbuster movies. So following the doctrine of if you can't do, teach, I may be the most qualified teacher of storytelling on the planet, since clearly doing it is not getting in my way. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is that there's a lot of helpful information on how to tell a good story. And the bad news is that almost none of it relates to how RPGs work. It's going to take a while to grab those two things, force them together, wrap a cable tie around them, and end up with a bodged, ad hoc, hopefully helpful guide to RPG storytelling. And I'm going to give it a go. Welcome to RPG Storytelling Part 1, in which we cover the basic concepts of a story and its structure. Tell the world's worst joke, then make it a slightly better joke, and introduce you to the only book on RPG storytelling, screenwriting, playwriting, video game writing, general fiction, short story, even stand-up comedy that you will ever need to read. Sadly, it's in Greek. So, a story. People will tell you that a story can be anything, and they're right. But we're not interested in writing a story. We want to write a good story. Good stories are different for a number of reasons, but one of them, the one we're going over today, is because they have a well-established sequence called the structure. We use it all the time, in fact, ourselves. So let me tell you a story. One day, a man was out walking when he was hit by a bus. He was rushed to hospital, and the doctors fought to save his life. Sadly, he died on the operating table, and his family was devastated. Now, in many ways, that's not a good story, but it does have the structure of one. We'll get to know how to make the story more interesting later, so don't panic about that. But for now, we're keeping this very simple so it can serve as a model for our very first concept, which is the structure of a story. So, the first element, structure. About 25 centuries ago, a chap wrote a book in which he suggested that you could separate the structure of a story from the narrative. In other words, the structure of our tragic bus story is identical if the person is a woman, if the bus is a car, if the man dies at the side of the road instead of in hospital. The actual words can all be changed, but the structure remains the same. This interesting fellow who wrote that book was called Aristotle, and the book he wrote was called The Poetics. Not much more than 25 years ago, which is much more recent, people started to analyse why some Hollywood movies were so much more satisfying than others. And they discovered that it was often down to the same thing: structure. In Hollywood, they call it the 3-act structure, but the basics of it are exactly the same as what Aristotle suggested. In order to support this for our purposes, our bus accident story has exactly 3 sentences. And the reason we've done that is so that each of the sentences represents just one and all of one of the 3 acts that make up a good, structured story. And believe me when I tell you this, this is exactly the way they do it in Hollywood. For good and ill. Because every great movie you've ever seen has been written by a professional screenwriter. But so have all the really terrible ones. So, Act 1. One day a man was out walking when he was hit by a bus. We do 2 things here. We set up the regular basic normality of the situation. The man was out walking. We then introduce an unusual event that derails him from his regular existence. He was hit by a bus. Act 2. He was rushed to hospital and the doctors fought to save his life. In Act 2, we introduce the complexities of the plot. We can essentially put as many ups and downs here as we want, as the doctors try one thing after another, each more desperate than the last as they desperately try to achieve his life-saving result. And Act 3. In Act 3, we learn the outcome of all that effort and the consequences of the outcome. Sadly, he died on the operating table and his family was devastated. Act 3 also has one fundamental truth. It can go the other way. In fact, it can go potentially many different ways. We can replace Act 3 with a line that says, "The doctors were successful and the man lived." We can do that without affecting the first 2 acts in any way whatsoever. A good Act 3 can be flipped and it doesn't change Acts 1 or 2. So, I hope you're ready for this, because as promised, I am now going to tell you the very worst joke you have ever heard. Holmes and Watson are lying side by side in a field one night. Holmes says to Watson, "You know my methods, Watson. Look up there and tell me what you observe." Watson thinks for a moment, then says, "I can see a great many stars, so the weather must be clear. I can see the pole star, so north is that way. And I can see the summer triangle, so I know it's the summertime." Holmes responds, "Well done, Watson. Excellent work." Now that, I'm sure you'll agree, is a terrible joke. It's a terrible joke because it isn't funny. Not being funny is a problem for a joke. It is a good example of the 3 acts, though. The thing that derails Watson's pleasant evening is Holmes asking him to use his observational skills. So that's the end of the first act. It's also the fact that Watson is derailed from whatever was going on before that makes him the hero of the story. He will have to overcome the challenge set by Holmes. Holmes praising Watson is the outcome of the story, so that's the 3rd act. The 2nd act consists of Watson's responses as he tries to overcome the challenges he's been set. So let's try the story again. Remember, we can always change the 3rd act without changing the structure. Holmes and Watson are lying side by side in a field one night. Holmes says to Watson, "You know my methods, Watson. Look up there and tell me what you observe." Watson thinks for a moment, then says, "I can see a great many stars, so the weather must be clear. I can see the pole star, so north is that way. And I can see the summer triangle, so I know it's the summertime." Holmes responds, "Not bad, Watson, but I saw even more than you. Someone has stolen our tent. Change the third act, and you change the whole story, despite not changing a single comma of the first two acts. So let's do this for a very well-known story. Something that I think everyone will be familiar with. Luke lives as a farmer, until one day his family is murdered by troops seeking the secret plans to a battle station. Taking the plans, he races to deliver them to rebel forces before the battle station can be turned against their hidden base. Joining the battle, he fights alongside the rebels to use the information in the plans to destroy the battle station before it can annihilate the rebellion. That's just 3 sentences. Again, one for each act. The story is satisfying when all of the complexities and characters of the film are added in for a number of reasons, but the one that's down to structure is that the outcome is genuinely in doubt. The third act could go entirely the other way, and yet the story would still make complete sense. I mean, it would be a bit more depressing. In the film, there are plenty of other characters, of course, but Luke is the fixed point, the one whom we see go from a routine, even a dull life, to become a hero. Now, before we call an end to part 1, I should give you a quick explanation of one important thing. I've given you a simple structure for a story, but I haven't actually told you why it's the right way to tell a story. Imagine you're telling a story, the bus story for example, but it could be anything. Why do we tell it that way? Why is it the same for a screenplay and a joke? Well, the reason is because stories have endings. The ending of the bus story is our poor chap dying, so that's the point of the story. But to tell that, we first have to tell how it happened, which is the second act. And the derailment at the end of the first act is part of that as well. So any story, in order to exist, has to have those 2 parts, the sequence of events, and a moment where we stop telling it, the end of the story. So we do that, and then, as a writer will tell you, stories are about people. So the bulk of the first act is to introduce our hero before the derailing event, to make the story about him. Then right at the end, we finish with the aftermath, the conclusion to the actual tale, which is what it all means to the people involved. Again, the reason we do this is because it makes it about people. And the best stories are about people, which is, I suppose, a rather selfish way of doing it, but it's the way humans have always been. We think we're much more important than anything else. I mean, I am. I don't know about my players, but sure. So, because of that, we end up with 5 actual components that go into the 3 acts. And if you weren't trying to do it the way a Hollywood screenwriter would do it, as a 3-act structure, you'd probably write it like this. You set the scene in Act 1. One day a man was out walking. You then give him a derailing event. He was hit by a bus. You come up with complications and challenges. He was rushed to hospital and the doctors fought to save his life. You get a resolution to the actual tale. Sadly, he died on the operating table. And then an aftermath. Why did you tell the story? Well, because his family was devastated. If you think about the last story you told your friends, I bet you can probably find the same basic structure hidden in there somewhere. It's just the pieces that a fully realised story will contain. Of course, to be fair, if you were telling the story just for your friends, you might have cut out on a few parts of it, made them a bit slimmer because they'd already know bits of it. They'd know you and some of the backstory. But I hope you get the point anyway. And next time we're going to move on a bit from the dry theoretical stuff and talk about how to use this very basic arrangement to tell stories in RPGs, where, as you will imagine, things get a little muddier. But a lot more fun.